The cabin was still smoking when my mother looked at me and said, "It's only a building, Arianna. Brandon didn't mean for this to happen." If it was an accident, why was my brother standing there without a scratch, refusing to meet my eyes? Why did an insurance investigator arrive before anyone had even finished putting out the fire? And why was he carrying a file with my name on it that I had never seen before? As firefighters searched through the ashes of the only place my grandfather ever trusted me with, the investigator stopped beside me, opened the folder, and quietly asked, "Miss Jordan, if you never requested this policy change 3 days ago, who did? If you're listening from somewhere in the world today, tell me your country and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's here with me. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice and finding the strength to set healthy boundaries, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me for the rest of this journey." 3 weeks before my cabin burned to the ground, the biggest problem in my life seemed to be finding enough free weekends to finish rebuilding the east porch before the first Colorado snowfall. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if that's why I missed so many warning signs. Not because they weren't there, but because I believed everyone else was operating with at least the same respect for honesty that I was. I should have known better. My name is Arianna Jordan, and I'm a structural engineer in Denver. My work revolves around finding weaknesses before they become disasters. I spend my days studying foundations, support beams, moisture damage load calculations, and the thousands of tiny details that determine whether a building survives another generation or slowly collapses under neglect. I've always believed structures tell the truth. Wood doesn't lie. Steel doesn't manipulate. Concrete doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. People, unfortunately, can do all three. The cabin sat about 2 hours west of Denver, tucked into a quiet valley surrounded by pine forests and granite ridges. It wasn't luxurious. It had 1 bedroom upstairs, a stone fireplace that my grandfather built himself, and a wraparound porch overlooking a creek that seemed to ignore time. Most people would have seen an aging mountain cabin. I saw the last place where I had ever felt completely accepted. My grandfather, Walter Jordan, had built it nearly 40 years earlier. He taught me how to replace warped floorboards before I was old enough to drive. He showed me how to identify structural rot simply by tapping a beam with the handle of a hammer. "Buildings speak Shuar," he used to tell me. "You just have to learn their language." Every summer throughout high school and college, while Brandon spent his vacations at lakes, concerts, and parties with friends, I spent mine beside Grandpa Walter repairing fences, staining cedar siding, replacing roofing shingles, and clearing fallen trees after storms. I never considered it work. Those weekends became my favorite memories. When Grandpa passed away 7 years earlier, his attorney called me into the office expecting an emotional conversation. Instead, he smiled gently and slid a folder across the desk. "Walter left very specific instructions." Inside was the deed. The cabin belonged entirely to me. I remember staring at the paperwork, convinced there had to be another page. "What about Mom and Dad?" I asked. "The house in Denver is already in their names." "And Brandon?" The attorney hesitated. "Your grandfather believed the cabin should belong to the person who treated it as a responsibility rather than an asset." That sentence changed more than I realized at the time. My parents never openly challenged the will. They simply acted as though it didn't matter. Whenever extended family visited, my mother would casually say things like, "Our family's cabin has always been everyone's place." If someone complimented the renovations, she'd answer before I could, "We've all put so much love into it." That wasn't true. Every dollar had come from me. Every permit, every inspection, every contractor invoice, every gallon of paint, every replacement window, every upgraded support beam. I kept detailed records because that's simply how my brain worked. My friends joked that I documented projects the way museums cataloged artwork. Maybe they were right. As an engineer, documentation wasn't optional, it was protection. By the beginning of that autumn, I had invested nearly 6 years restoring the property. The electrical system had been completely modernized. The plumbing had been replaced. The foundation had been reinforced after discovering frost damage beneath the northwest corner. The cabin wasn't just sentimental anymore. It was safe. It was beautiful. It was finally ready to last another generation. Then Brandon called. I almost didn't answer because I was reviewing inspection drawings for a commercial renovation downtown. "Ari," he said cheerfully, "I've got a favor." That sentence alone usually cost me money. "What is it?" "A few friends are coming into town next weekend. I was thinking we'd spend 3 days at the cabin." "No." There was a pause. "You didn't even think about it." "I already have contractors scheduled." "You can move them." "No." His voice lost its friendliness. "You barely use the place." "I was there last weekend." "Exactly, 1 weekend. I've been restoring it for 6 years. So let somebody enjoy it." I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. "The answer is still no." He laughed softly. "You've always been dramatic." "No, Brandon, I've been consistent." The call ended with him muttering something I couldn't quite hear before hanging up. I figured that would be the end of it. Instead, my phone rang again less than 20 minutes later. "Mom." I considered letting it go to voicemail. Experience told me she was calling for one reason only. I answered anyway. "Arianna," Linda said before I could speak. "Why are you making life difficult?" I looked out the office window toward the Denver skyline. "Because I won't hand over my property." "It's not just your property." I almost laughed. "It literally is." "That's not what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean." She sighed dramatically. "Your brother has had a hard year." That part was true. Brandon's latest landscaping company had folded after less than 18 months. Before that, there had been a food truck. Before that, a home renovation business. Before that, an online retail store. Every failure somehow became someone else's responsibility. "He needs somewhere to relax," she continued. "He needs to pay his creditors." "Arianna." "He owes people money. Families should support each other." "I've supported him plenty." I had. There had been small loans years earlier that somehow became gifts. Holiday expenses, emergency car repairs, one security deposit. Every promise to repay eventually disappeared into silence. Mom changed tactics. "You've always been successful." "I've worked for it." "Exactly. So because I worked hard, I owe Brandon another opportunity." "He's your brother." There it was. The sentence that had followed me through most of my adult life. He's your brother. Whenever Brandon missed rent, whenever Brandon needed money, whenever Brandon ignored responsibilities, whenever Brandon disappointed everyone, somehow being his sister automatically made me responsible for repairing the consequences. Before I could answer, another voice joined the call. Dad. "Ari." "Hi, Dad." "Maybe just let him use it for a couple days." "I already said no." "You know your mother worries." "I know." "Then help us out." The familiar exhaustion settled over me. "Dad, why does helping always move in one direction?" Silence. Finally, he answered quietly. "Sometimes peace costs something." His words lingered long after the call ended. Peace costs something. For years, that something had almost always been me. That evening, I drove to the cabin anyway, not because I doubted my decision, because I wanted another quiet weekend before winter. The sun had already slipped behind the mountains when I unlocked the front door. Everything smelled like cedar and fresh varnish. The porch railings I had installed the previous month glowed softly beneath the porch lights. Inside Grandpa Walter's old rocking chair still sat beside the fireplace. I ran my hand across its worn wooden arm. Sometimes I could almost hear him laughing after one of my crooked teenage repairs. "You'll get better," he'd tell me. "You always do." Before unpacking my overnight bag, I checked the security system. Everything showed normal: doors secured, windows secured, motion sensors active, cloud backup connected. Perfect. As I organized a few inspection receipts into a file drawer, I noticed the envelope where I kept Grandpa Walter's handwritten letters. I hadn't opened them in months. For reasons I still can't explain, I pulled one out. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. His handwriting remained unmistakable, strong, patient, steady. One sentence had been underlined: "Never let guilt become the price of protecting what you've earned." I smiled. It sounded exactly like something he would have said while handing me another hammer. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Outside, the mountains were completely quiet. Inside, the cabin felt exactly as it always had: safe. I had no idea that less than 24 hours later, someone would decide my answer didn't matter. Around 11 that night, as I finished reviewing blueprints at the kitchen table, my phone vibrated. A notification from the cabin security app. Front door opened. I froze. I was already inside. For a second, I questioned my own eyes. I looked from the notification to the front door only 20 feet away. It was closed, locked. Nothing had moved. The security app flashed again. Front door opened, 11:07 p.m. Then another notification appeared. User access temporary code accepted. I had never created a temporary code. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I quietly walked to the door and checked the deadbolt. Still locked. I opened the security dashboard. The system showed the front door had been unlocked from the outside for 18 seconds before being closed again. That was impossible, unless someone had tried to enter before changing their mind, or unless the system itself had registered an old access event that had finally synced after losing signal. Neither explanation made me feel better. I immediately opened the camera feed. The front porch camera buffered for several long seconds before displaying the empty porch beneath the security light. No one. The driveway camera showed my SUV parked exactly where I had left it. The woods were still. The only movement came from pine branches swaying in the wind. I walked outside with a flashlight anyway. Years of working around construction sites had taught me that ignoring strange signs usually made problems more expensive later. The porch boards creaked beneath my boots. I circled the cabin. Nothing. No footprints. No vehicles. No voices. When I reached the back porch, I noticed something odd. The motion light had switched on, even though nothing appeared to be there. I swept the flashlight across the yard. Only shadows. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a delayed system notification caused by poor mountain internet. It wasn't the first time cloud services had lagged. Still, before going to bed, I changed every access code. Every single one. The next morning, I drove back to Denver for work. By Monday afternoon, I had almost forgotten the strange alert. Then my phone rang. It was Brandon. "You at work?" "Yes." "I'm heading up to the cabin Friday." "No, you're not." He laughed. "Mom said you'd calm down." "I didn't." "You'll survive one weekend." "I already answered." "Arianna, stop acting like you're guarding Fort Knox. I'm protecting property that belongs to me. It belonged to Grandpa. He gave it to me. He left it to family. No, he left it to me." His voice sharpened. "You've always loved correcting people." "I love facts." "Same thing. No Brandon." "It is when you're trying to make everyone feel small." I closed my office door before responding. "This conversation is over." You don't get to decide that. I actually do. I hung up. Less than 5 minutes later, my mother called. This time, I let it ring. She left a voicemail. Arianna, you're embarrassing your brother. Sometimes generosity matters more than legal paperwork. I listened twice. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to remember her exact words. Legal paperwork. Interesting choice. She didn't say ownership. She didn't say inheritance. She said paperwork, as though the deed were merely an inconvenience. By Friday afternoon, I drove toward the cabin earlier than planned. Part of me simply wanted another peaceful weekend. Another part wanted to make absolutely certain Brandon respected my decision. The farther I climbed into the mountains, the weaker my cell signal became. When the cabin finally came into view, I knew immediately something was wrong. There were vehicles everywhere. 4 pickup trucks, 3 SUVs, 2 cars parked partly on the grass. Music echoed through the trees. People were laughing. Someone had hung string lights across the porch railing I had finished restoring only weeks before. I pulled into the driveway and just stared. For several seconds, nobody noticed me. Then Brandon stepped onto the porch carrying a beer. He smiled as though I had arrived at a family barbecue. There she is. I got out of my SUV. What are you doing? We're hanging out. I told you no. You weren't using it. I own it. So everyone should leave. His friends suddenly became very interested in their drinks. One couple quietly walked toward their truck. Nobody wanted to be standing in the middle of a family argument. Brandon shrugged. They already drove 2 hours. That isn't my problem. It could stop being your problem if you'd relax. I climbed the porch steps. The front door stood wide open. My stomach tightened. Inside the living room looked nothing like I had left it. The dining table had been pushed against the wall. The handmade quilt my grandmother stitched decades ago had been tossed onto the floor. Someone had placed muddy hiking boots on Grandpa Walter's cedar coffee table. Music blasted through portable speakers sitting directly on top of the antique writing desk. Beer bottles covered the kitchen counters. The smell of alcohol mixed with smoke from an outdoor grill drifting through the open windows. I slowly walked from room to room. The guest bedroom mattress had been dragged into the hallway. One of Grandpa's fishing rods leaned against a wall with its tip snapped clean off. Several framed family photographs had been removed from the shelves and stacked carelessly in a corner. None of the damage was catastrophic. Yet. But every room felt violated. I heard footsteps behind me. Brandon. You look like someone died. I turned toward him. My grandfather spent years building this place. And people are enjoying it. They're destroying it. That's dramatic. I took a slow breath. Arguing wouldn't repair anything. It certainly wouldn't convince Brandon to suddenly respect boundaries he had ignored his entire life. Instead, I reached into my backpack and quietly removed my phone. What are you doing? Documenting. You seriously can't be serious. I ignored him. Room by room, I photographed everything. The broken fishing rod, the scratched hardwood floor, the muddy furniture, the damaged cabinets, the overflowing trash bags, the cigarette burns beginning to appear on the porch railing. Every image automatically uploaded into encrypted cloud storage through the engineering documentation app I used for work. Timestamp, GPS location, original metadata preserved. Brandon laughed while watching me. You planning to sue your own brother? I'm creating a record. For what? So nobody has to rely on memory. His smile faded slightly. People who lie often dislike records. I continued taking photographs. One of Brandon's friends quietly approached me near the kitchen. I'm really sorry, she whispered. I didn't know this wasn't okay. You don't owe me an apology. She nodded awkwardly before walking outside. Apparently, Brandon hadn't told everyone the truth. As I stepped onto the back porch, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. 3 red gasoline containers sat beside the storage shed. Each one was full. I frowned. "Why are these here?" Brandon answered from behind me. "Generator." "What generator?" "In case the power goes out." "We don't even own a generator." He hesitated for half a second. "I'm borrowing one tomorrow." The explanation felt rehearsed. I looked toward the electrical panel mounted beside the porch. The cabin had underground utility service. Power outages were uncommon here. Even when storms knocked electricity out, I normally used battery-powered emergency lighting. There had never been a reason to store that much gasoline on the property, especially beside a wooden cabin. I took 2 photographs, then 2 more from different angles. Brandon noticed. "You photograph everything, don't you? Only things that don't make sense." His expression hardened. "You really don't trust family?" I met his eyes. "No. I trust behavior." For the first time all afternoon, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than the mountains surrounding the cabin. Eventually, I packed my overnight bag back into the SUV. "You leaving?" "Yes." "Good." "I'll have contractors inspect the property Monday." He rolled his eyes. "Whatever." As I climbed into the driver's seat, my phone vibrated. A notification from the security system. Backyard camera connection lost. I looked toward the rear corner of the cabin where the camera had been mounted beneath the roofline. From the driveway, I couldn't see it. I looked back at Brandon. He was already walking toward the backyard, carrying one of the red gasoline containers. I didn't drive away immediately. My engine was running, my hands were on the steering wheel, but my eyes stayed fixed on Brandon as he disappeared behind the cabin with the red gasoline container. Every instinct I had as an engineer told me something about that picture was wrong. Gasoline wasn't unusual in the mountains. People used it for chainsaws, wood splitters, and generators. But context mattered. There was no generator. There had never been one. And the timing bothered me even more than the fuel itself. The backyard camera had gone offline less than 30 seconds before Brandon carried the can out of sight. I grabbed my phone and zoomed in on the last still image the system had uploaded before losing connection. The resolution wasn't perfect. The camera had captured only part of the backyard. But something caught my attention. The mounting bracket looked twisted, not weather damaged, bent, as if someone had forced the camera downward. I saved the image into a separate evidence folder, then I drove home. I barely slept that night. Not because I believed Brandon intended to burn the cabin. At least not yet. I simply couldn't shake the feeling that someone was deliberately creating blind spots. Monday morning, before heading to my office, I called the restoration contractor who had been helping me finish the final phase of the renovation. His name was Eric Lawson. We'd worked together on 3 projects over the previous 4 years, and I trusted his judgment. "Morning, Arianna. Can you meet me at the cabin today? Everything okay?" "I'm not sure." He heard something in my voice. "I'll move a few appointments." By noon, we were walking through every room together. The party was over. Brandon and his friends were gone. The silence felt almost unsettling after seeing the place packed with people only 2 days earlier. Eric slowly examined the hardwood floors. "They dragged furniture." "I know." He knelt beside a deep scratch running across the living room. "This wasn't here last month." "No." We continued upstairs. A bedroom window had been left partially open despite 2 nights of rain. Moisture had already begun soaking into the wooden frame. In the kitchen, someone had chipped the edge of the granite countertop. Outside, cigarette butts littered the yard. The porch railing had several fresh scorch marks where fireworks or cigarettes had apparently burned against the cedar. Eric shook his head. This isn't normal wear. I wasn't expecting normal. He looked at me. You want estimates? I want everything documented. He smiled slightly. I figured. For the next 4 hours, we photographed every damaged area. Measurements, material lists, estimated repair costs. Nothing dramatic, nothing impossible to fix, but enough to establish exactly what condition the cabin was in before any future dispute. By late afternoon, Eric handed me a preliminary report. I'll email the final version tonight. Thank you. As I locked the front door behind us, a pickup truck slowed on the gravel road. The driver rolled down her window. You must be Arianna. I nodded. I'm Megan Brooks. I recognized the name immediately. She owned the neighboring property nearly half a mile away. We'd waved to each other before, but had never really talked. I hope you don't mind me stopping. Not at all. She glanced toward the cabin. There were a lot of people here Saturday. There were. She hesitated. I wasn't sure whether I should say anything. My attention sharpened. About what? I was walking my dog Saturday morning. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. I heard your brother talking. What did he say? He was laughing with another guy. She frowned, trying to remember the exact words. I think he said something like, she paused. If anything happens, insurance pays. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Are you sure? I can't swear to every word. She looked embarrassed. But I remember the insurance part because I thought it was an odd thing to joke about. I thanked her. She drove away. I stood in the driveway much longer than necessary. Maybe Brandon had simply made another careless joke. He had always joked about money, about responsibility, about consequences. Still, the timing bothered me. That evening, I returned to Denver. After dinner, I opened Eric's inspection report. 47 pages, photographs, repair estimates, moisture readings, structural observations. Exactly the kind of documentation insurance companies appreciated. As I filed everything into the renovation folder, another thought crossed my mind. If there were ever another claim involving the cabin, these records would establish exactly what condition it had been in only days earlier. I almost laughed at myself. I was creating evidence for a problem that didn't exist. At least I believed it didn't. The next morning, during a break between meetings, I called my insurance company. Mostly because Megan's comment wouldn't leave my mind. After verifying my identity, the representative pulled up my account. Everything looks current, Ms. Jordan. I have a question. Of course. Has anyone contacted you recently regarding my cabin policy? There was a brief pause as she searched the records. Actually, my grip tightened around the phone. There was an inquiry last Thursday. What kind of inquiry? The caller requested information about your coverage limits, replacement cost, and optional policy increases. I didn't make that call. Silence. I'm sorry. I never called. The representative hesitated. The caller passed several security questions. Which questions? They confirmed your mailing address. That's public. They also confirmed the property's construction year. Anyone in my family would know that. And, she stopped. What? They correctly answered the last 4 digits of the policy number. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Those digits weren't written anywhere obvious. They appeared only on the policy documents. Documents I kept in a locked file cabinet at home. Except, there had once been another copy. My parents'. Years earlier when Grandpa Walter died, I'd given Mom and Dad copies of every inheritance document, including the insurance paperwork, in case anything happened while I was traveling for work. I had forgotten all about it. The representative continued. The caller didn't make any changes. They only asked questions. They asked what would be required to increase the policy limit. My mouth went dry. Did they identify themselves? They identified themselves as Arianna Jordan. I need a copy of that call log. We can provide a written activity report. I'd appreciate that. Within 20 minutes, the report arrived in my email. The call had lasted 11 minutes. Time, date. Representative ID, general subject. It wasn't proof of fraud, but it was proof someone had impersonated me. I printed the report, then I opened a new folder on my laptop. The title was simple: Cabin Documentation. Inside, I created separate folders: property, security, inspection, insurance, communications, witnesses. Years in engineering had taught me something invaluable. Evidence loses power when it's scattered. Organized evidence tells a story. That evening, while reviewing the insurance activity report one more time, something suddenly struck me. The caller had known not only my personal information, they had known details about optional coverage endorsements that weren't discussed in the original policy. Those endorsements had only been added during my last renewal, less than 6 months earlier. Very few people even knew I'd updated the policy. I leaned back slowly. Then another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, my parents had visited my Denver townhouse for dinner. Mom had asked where I kept all those boring house papers because she wanted to compare property tax rates with hers. I'd laughed and pointed toward the home office filing cabinet. At some point during dinner, I had stepped outside to answer a work call. They had been alone inside the house for nearly 15 minutes. At the time, it hadn't meant anything. Now it did. I stared at the printed insurance report lying on my desk. Then I whispered words I never imagined saying about my own parents. They had access. I read those 3 words over and over. They had access, not proof, not guilt, just opportunity. As an engineer, I'd learned never to confuse suspicion with evidence. Buildings didn't fail because someone guessed they might. You had to identify the exact sequence of events that led to the collapse. I forced myself to think the same way now. Could my parents have looked through my files while I was outside taking that phone call? Yes. Did that mean I didn't know? Could Brandon have copied the policy number from them later? Possibly. None of it explained why someone had been asking about increasing my coverage. I closed the folder. Until I had facts, everything else was noise. The following week was unusually busy at work. Our firm was inspecting a municipal library expansion, and I spent 3 straight days on construction sites instead of behind a desk. Concrete pours, steel inspections, contractor meetings. It was the kind of work that demanded complete concentration. For a while, the cabin slipped into the background. The only reassuring part was that the security system showed nothing unusual. The backyard camera still hadn't come back online. According to the monitoring company, the device had likely been physically damaged. A replacement had already been shipped. I scheduled the installation for the following weekend. Friday afternoon, just after 3 o'clock, I was reviewing load calculations when my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of my neighbor, Megan Brooks. I answered immediately. Megan. Arianna. Her voice was shaking. You need to come. Every muscle in my body tightened. What happened? I can see smoke. My chair nearly tipped backward as I stood. Smoke. Your cabin. For one impossible second, my mind refused to understand the sentence. Then training took over. I grabbed my keys. I'm leaving now. The fire department is already on the way. I'll be there as fast as I can. The drive into the mountains usually felt peaceful. That afternoon, it became the longest 2 hours of my life. Every mile brought another terrible possibility. Maybe it was a chimney fire. Maybe lightning had struck. Maybe the smoke wasn't even coming from my property. I tried to construct reasonable explanations. Each one collapsed before I reached the next curve in the road. About 20 minutes from the cabin, I saw the first fire engine racing past in the opposite direction, then another. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. By the time I reached the valley, thick gray smoke still hung above the trees. The smell hit me before I even turned into the driveway. Burned cedar, wet ash, charred insulation. The kind of smell that settles into your clothes long after you've left. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the road. Firefighters were rolling hoses back toward their trucks. Water still dripped from the blackened skeleton of what had once been my cabin. I stopped my SUV without remembering how I'd parked. For several moments I couldn't move. The wraparound porch was gone. The roof had collapsed inward. The stone chimney still stood surrounded by piles of smoking timber. Everything Grandpa Walter had built with his own hands. Everything I'd spent 6 years restoring, reduced to black beams and steam. Someone touched my shoulder. I turned. Mom. Linda's eyes were red, but there were no tears. Oh, sweetheart. I looked at her. What happened? It happened so fast. How? We don't know. I searched her face. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Dad walked over a moment later. Richard looked exhausted. The firefighters think it might have been electrical? My head snapped toward him. Who told you that? Well, they're still investigating. No one has said that. He hesitated. I just assumed. You assumed? Before he could answer, Brandon approached from the other side of the driveway. He looked dirty. His jeans were stained with soot. I tried to help. When did you get here? Not long before the fire department. What were you doing here? He shrugged. Just checking on the place. I stared at him. You drove 2 hours to check on a cabin I told you not to visit. I thought maybe you'd cooled off. With no warning. His expression hardened. I don't need your permission to visit family property. It isn't family property. Mom stepped between us. This isn't the time. No. She lowered her voice. People are watching. There it was. Not concern, not grief, image, always image. I looked around. Several firefighters were speaking quietly near one of the trucks. Neighbors stood farther down the road. No one was paying attention to us. Only my mother believed appearances still mattered. I walked past all of them toward the fire scene. One firefighter intercepted me politely. I'm sorry, ma'am. We can't let anyone inside the perimeter yet. I'm the owner. I understand. He nodded sympathetically. The structure isn't stable. My voice broke before I finished. He softened immediately. I'm sorry. I looked beyond him. The old rocking chair Grandpa Walter had built was gone. The cedar staircase had collapsed. Even the workshop behind the cabin had partially burned. Years of careful restoration had disappeared in one afternoon. A battalion chief approached carrying a clipboard. Miss Jordan. Yes. I'm Chief Ramirez. He extended his hand. I'm sorry for your loss. Do you know what caused it? Not yet. My father said electrical. The chief shook his head immediately. No. So that isn't the preliminary finding? We don't speculate. He looked toward the remains of the cabin. Our fire investigator will examine everything before any determination is made. Relief and dread arrived together. At least no one had blamed faulty wiring. Not yet. I reached into my purse and removed a folded document. The final electrical inspection certificate. Approved, signed. Dated only 13 days earlier. Every circuit, every breaker, every panel, every outlet, everything had passed. I slipped it back into my bag, not because I wanted to hide it, because I knew the right time to present evidence was after investigators asked for it. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, firefighters gradually packed up. The smoke became thinner. The noise faded. Then I noticed a dark gray SUV pulling slowly into the driveway. It wasn't another emergency vehicle. The logo on the driver's door read, Rocky Mountain Mutual Insurance. A man in his early 50s stepped out carrying a leather briefcase instead of firefighting equipment. He wasn't in a hurry. He looked around the property once before walking directly toward me. He extended a business card. Ms. Jordan. Yes. I'm Daniel Cross. His handshake was calm, measured. I'm the insurance investigator assigned to your claim. My claim? Not exactly. I frowned. What does that mean? He studied my face for a second, almost as if confirming something. Then he opened his briefcase. Instead of looking at the burned cabin, he removed a document from a folder. I have a question before we discuss today's fire. I stared at him. He slid the paper toward me. Across the top in bold letters, I read Policy Change Request. My name appeared beneath it, but I had never seen the document before. Daniel looked at me carefully. Ms. Jordan? He paused. Can you tell me why someone requested a significant increase in your cabin's insurance coverage 3 days before it burned? For a moment, the sounds around me disappeared. The firefighters, the crackling timber, the low conversations. Everything faded beneath one impossible sentence. Someone requested a significant increase in your cabin's insurance coverage 3 days before it burned. I looked down at the document in Daniel Cross's hands. My name appeared beneath the request. The address was correct. The policy number was correct. The electronic signature looked close enough to mine that most people would never question it. But it wasn't mine. I didn't submit this. Daniel didn't react. Instead, he asked quietly, Have you seen this document before today? No. You've never authorized anyone else to make changes to your policy. Never. He watched me for another second before closing the folder. I appreciate the direct answer. That surprised me. Aren't you going to ask whether I'm telling the truth? I already did. And you answered immediately. His tone remained calm. People planning insurance fraud usually spend more time calculating the safest response. I let out a slow breath. So what happens now? Now we investigate. He handed me his business card. I'll need copies of every inspection, renovation, and maintenance record related to this property. I have all of them. I suspected you might. He glanced toward the remains of the cabin. Most owners don't document 6 years of renovations. I do. I know. The statement caught my attention. You know. When I reviewed your policy history this afternoon, I noticed dozens of valuation updates supported by engineering reports and photographs. He gave a small nod. That's unusual. My profession makes me a little obsessive. Today that may become very helpful. Before I could ask another question, another investigator approached Daniel. They stepped aside and spoke quietly. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But one phrase carried across the wet gravel. Multiple points of origin! My heartbeat quickened. I had spent enough time around fire investigations to understand exactly what those words suggested. Not proof. Suspicion. Accidental fires generally started in one place. Multiple independent ignition points demanded an explanation. Daniel returned a minute later. I'm going to ask something difficult. Go ahead. When was the last time you personally entered the cabin? 6 days ago. Were there any electrical problems? No. Gas leaks? No. Heating equipment? No. I opened the digital folder on my phone. In fact, I handed him the inspection certificate. The entire electrical system passed inspection less than 2 weeks ago. Daniel carefully examined every page. This was performed by a licensed contractor, yes, and independently reviewed. He looked up. You weren't exaggerating. No, I don't. He smiled very slightly. I've noticed. He slipped the report into a protective folder. This rules out several possibilities. Not all of them. Several. I understood the difference. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, investigators began marking sections of the burned structure with small numbered flags. Every flag represented a location that would later be examined. The precision comforted me. Truth left traces, even after fire. Before leaving, Daniel stopped beside me one last time. I'll contact you tomorrow. I'll be available. Please don't remove anything from the property. I won't. And if anyone asks you not to cooperate... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I understand. He nodded once before walking away. By the time I returned to Denver that night, exhaustion had settled into every part of my body. I didn't bother unpacking. Instead, I opened my laptop and began organizing every document connected to the cabin: inspection reports, building permits, receipts, contractor invoices, photographs, maintenance logs, electrical certifications, security records. I created a shared cloud folder and copied everything into it. Just after midnight, my phone buzzed. Mom. I let it ring. She called again, then Dad, then Brandon. Finally, I answered. Mom spoke first. Arianna, your father and I have been talking. I remained silent. Maybe we don't need to involve the insurance company any more than necessary. I blinked. What? You know how complicated these investigations become. It's already being investigated. I mean, she hesitated. Sometimes accidents are just accidents. No one has determined it was an accident. Arianna, no, please don't make this worse. I sat perfectly still. Worse for who? Silence. Then she answered carefully. For everyone. Everyone. Not the truth, not me. Everyone. I'll cooperate fully. You don't understand. Then explain. Another pause. Instead of answering, Dad spoke. Daniel Cross is just doing his job. I know. If investigators keep asking questions, Brandon could become nervous. That sentence landed harder than anything else said that evening. Could become nervous. Not was devastated, not was grieving. Nervous? I lowered my voice. Why would Brandon be nervous? Neither of my parents answered. Eventually, Mom said softly, He's already blaming himself. For what? He thinks maybe the party damaged something. A damaged table doesn't burn down a cabin. Just, her voice cracked, think carefully before you accuse your brother. I haven't accused anyone. I ended the call. Then I replayed it from the beginning. Twice. Not because I wanted to, because I wanted every word exactly as spoken. The next morning, Daniel emailed requesting access to my security system. Fortunately, the cameras automatically backed up every recording to encrypted cloud storage. Even if a camera had been destroyed previously, uploaded footage remained preserved. I generated a secure download link and sent it to him. An hour later, he called. I've reviewed most of the footage, and the backyard camera stopped transmitting exactly when you said. I assumed it had been damaged. It had. Can you tell how? It appears someone physically forced it downward before disconnecting it. I closed my eyes. So it wasn't weather? No. My stomach tightened. What about the other cameras? The front and driveway systems continued recording. He paused. There are several hours of footage from the day of Brandon's gathering. My pulse quickened. Did you find anything? I'd rather show you in person. When? I'm already driving to your office. 2 hours later, Daniel sat across from me in a conference room. He connected an encrypted drive to my laptop. The first video showed Brandon greeting guests outside the cabin. Nothing unusual. The second showed people carrying coolers. The third captured furniture being moved. Again, nothing criminal. Then Daniel opened another clip. This was recorded approximately 42 minutes before the backyard camera failed. The image showed Brandon walking across the yard. In his right hand, one of the red gasoline containers. He disappeared behind the cabin. 38 seconds later, the video shook violently. The picture tilted downward toward the ground, then everything went black. Daniel paused the recording. "I don't own a generator," I said quietly. "I know." I told him that. "I read your earlier statement." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, Daniel opened another file. "This arrived from the state laboratory this morning." He slid the report across the table. The highlighted sentence was impossible to misunderstand. "Accelerant residue detected on exterior decking and lower wall assembly." I looked up slowly. Daniel's expression hadn't changed. "Gasoline doesn't prove intent," he said carefully, "but it does prove something else." "What?" "The fire did not begin the way your family has been describing." Then he closed the report. "There is still one question we haven't answered." "What question?" He looked directly at me. "If Brandon carried the gasoline, who tried to increase the insurance policy?" Daniel's question stayed with me all the way home. If Brandon carried the gasoline, who tried to increase the insurance policy? Until that moment, I had been thinking about one person at a time. Either Brandon had acted alone, or someone else had manipulated him. Now I realized those possibilities weren't mutually exclusive. One person could have planned, another could have carried it out. The next morning, I met Daniel at the regional office of Rocky Mountain Mutual. Unlike the dramatic insurance offices I'd seen in television shows, this one looked surprisingly ordinary. Gray carpet glass conference rooms and employees quietly working behind computer monitors. Daniel led me into a secure meeting room. A woman in her 40s was already waiting with a laptop. "Arianna, this is Karen Mitchell." Karen smiled politely. "I supervise our special investigations unit." "The fraud division?" I asked. "In simple terms, yes." She rotated her laptop toward me. "We've completed a forensic review of the policy activity." Several timelines appeared on the screen: phone calls, emails, login attempts, electronic authentication records. Karen pointed to the first entry. 3 weeks ago, someone called our customer service department pretending to be you." "I know about that call." "We've now identified what happened afterward." She clicked again. A second timeline appeared. "The caller requested information only." "So they were gathering information." "Exactly." She zoomed into another section. 3 days before the fire, a formal request to increase the policy limit was submitted through the online customer portal. I leaned closer. "I never logged into the portal." "We know." She highlighted another line. "The request passed identity verification." "How?" Karen answered without hesitation. The person answered every authentication challenge correctly. Address, date of birth, policy number, security questions, everything. Daniel folded his hands. "Whoever submitted it knew you extremely well." I looked at both of them. "Or had access to my personal documents." Karen nodded. "That's one possibility." She opened another window. "Fortunately, electronic records leave fingerprints. Not literal fingerprints, digital ones. Every login generated information most users never noticed. Device identification, browser version, operating system, internet provider, connection history." She enlarged a single line. "The request came from a Windows laptop." Daniel added quietly, "The same laptop had never accessed your insurance account before." "So, whose was it?" Karen hesitated. We obtained additional information through legal process. She turned the monitor another few inches toward me. The internet account holder's name appeared at the top, Richard Jordan. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. My father's computer, more accurately, Karen said carefully, your father's home internet connection. I stared at the screen. There had to be another explanation. Maybe someone hacked the network. Maybe Karen interrupted my thoughts. That's not all. She clicked again. A copy of the policy request appeared. Every field looked professional, almost perfect. Except one. The confirmation email. I frowned. That's not my email. No. Karen enlarged it. Linda. Jordan 58. My mother's email address. I looked at Daniel. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I whispered. So the request came from my father's internet. Karen nodded. And the confirmation was sent to my mother's email. Correct. No one spoke. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was simply trying to reconcile two completely different versions of my parents. The people who had taught me not to cheat on school exams. The people who insisted honesty mattered. The people who had apparently helped someone impersonate me. Daniel finally broke the silence. We're still investigating intent. I laughed quietly. It wasn't a happy laugh. You really choose your words carefully. I have to. He leaned forward. Evidence tells us what happened. It doesn't immediately explain why. I understood. Motive still mattered. Karen closed her laptop. We invited your parents here this morning. I looked up. You what? They agreed to answer questions voluntarily. When? They're already in another conference room. My heartbeat accelerated. I didn't know they were coming. We thought it would produce more candid conversations. Daniel stood. You don't have to participate. I considered leaving. Part of me wanted to. Another part had spent years watching difficult conversations happen behind closed doors. Not this time. I'll stay. 10 minutes later, Daniel escorted Linda and Richard into the room. My mother stopped walking the instant she saw me. Arianna. Her surprise looked genuine. What are you doing here, eh? I could ask you the same question. Dad looked exhausted. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Karen introduced herself and explained that the meeting was being documented. No one was under arrest. No one was being accused. They simply wanted clarification regarding recent insurance activity. Mom answered first. We've already told everyone we don't know anything. Karen slid a printed document across the table. Mrs. Jordan, is this your email address? Mom glanced down. Yes. And did you receive this confirmation message? She hesitated. I don't remember. Karen waited. No pressure, no raised voice. Just silence. Eventually, Mom sighed. I saw an email. What kind of email? I didn't really read it. Why not? I assumed Brandon was helping Arianna organize insurance. The explanation collapsed before it reached the end of the sentence. Even she seemed to realize it. I looked at her. You thought Brandon was managing insurance on a property he doesn't own. She avoided my eyes. Dad finally spoke. I used my laptop. The room became completely still. Mom looked at him in shock. Richard? It's true. He rubbed both hands together nervously. Brandon asked me to help. Daniel asked quietly, help with what? He said. Dad swallowed. He said Arianna's coverage was outdated. I stared at him. And you believed that? He said you were busy. So instead of calling me? I didn't think. No. I interrupted gently. You didn't. The words hurt him. I could see it. But they were true. Daniel continued. Did you know the policy limit was being increased? Dad nodded once. I knew. Did you know Arianna hadn't approved it? Silence. Daniel repeated the question. This time Dad answered. I assumed she'd be grateful later. I almost couldn't process what I was hearing. You forged my authorization because you thought I'd thank you. Mom suddenly burst into tears. It wasn't supposed to become this. Daniel looked towards her. What was it supposed to become? She covered her face. We were trying to help Brandon. Finally, there it was. Not confusion, not misunderstanding, the truth. Mom lowered her hands. He lost everything. I know. He said if the cabin were worth more. She stopped speaking. Daniel finished the sentence. The insurance payout would be larger. She closed her eyes, a tiny nod. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound came from the air conditioner humming overhead. I looked at my parents. Not with anger. Not anymore. With something much heavier. Recognition. This hadn't started with the fire. It hadn't even started with the insurance policy. It had started years earlier, every time Brandon failed, and someone else quietly rearranged reality to protect him. Every excuse, every loan, every lie softened into, he's just having a hard time. Every consequence delayed, until eventually, reality itself became negotiable. Daniel slowly closed the investigation file. His voice remained calm. Mr. and Mrs. Jordan. Both of them looked up. At this point, this is no longer simply a property loss investigation. Neither of them answered. Daniel continued. The unauthorized policy modification, the forged authorization, and the circumstances surrounding the fire require us to refer this matter to state fraud investigators. Mom whispered, fraud. Daniel nodded. The legal consequences no longer depend solely on what burned. He paused. They now depend on who tried to profit from it. No one spoke after Daniel said the word fraud. My mother stared at the conference table as though the polished wood might somehow provide an escape. My father looked 20 years older than he had that morning. For the first time in my life, I realized neither of them expected someone to challenge the version of events they had built. They expected another family conversation, another compromise, another quiet sacrifice. Instead, they had walked into an investigation supported by documents they couldn't explain away. Daniel gathered his files. I'll leave the next discussion to counsel. He stood and offered me a respectful nod. If additional information comes in, I'll contact you directly. After he left, Karen handed each of us a business card. If investigators need follow-up interviews, someone from our office will reach out. She paused before looking at me. Ms. Jordan, if anyone asks you to withdraw documents or alter your statement, please let us know immediately. I will. Within minutes, the conference room was empty except for my parents and me. None of us seemed eager to leave. Finally, Mom broke the silence. Arianna, I looked at her. We can fix this. I didn't answer. We'll pay for the repairs. There isn't a cabin left to repair. We'll help rebuild. I slowly shook my head. This stopped being about rebuilding the moment someone pretended to be me. Dad leaned forward. Your mother means we want to make things right. Do you? He nodded. I believe you do. His shoulders relaxed slightly. But wanting to fix something isn't the same as accepting what happened. Neither of them argued. Mom reached across the table. I know we made mistakes. Mistakes. Arianna, you accidentally misplaced my car keys once. She looked down. You accidentally forgot my birthday when I was 12. She closed her eyes. You accidentally overcooked Thanksgiving turkey. I took a slow breath. But nobody accidentally impersonates someone. The room became painfully quiet. Dad rubbed his forehead. Brandon was desperate. I know. He said increasing the coverage wasn't hurting anyone. And you believed him. He promised nothing would happen. There it was, the sentence I'd been waiting to hear. He promised. Not that my parents had planned a fire, not that they expected the cabin to burn, only that they had trusted Brandon's explanation without questioning why someone would secretly increase insurance on property that wasn't his. I asked carefully, "When Brandon asked for your help?" Dad nodded. "Did he explain why the policy needed to be changed without telling me?" He hesitated. "He said you were traveling." "I wasn't." "He said you hated paperwork." I almost laughed. Anyone who knew me even casually would know that paperwork was practically my favorite language. Mom finally looked at me again. "We should have called." "Yes." "We know that now." I stood. "So do I." Neither of them tried to stop me. Outside the Colorado afternoon felt strangely peaceful. The mountains surrounding the insurance office seemed almost indifferent to everything happening inside. My phone buzzed. Olivia Chen. I'd contacted her 2 days earlier after Daniel suggested I consider legal representation. She was waiting in her office. An hour later, I placed every document I had collected onto her conference table. Inspection reports, security logs, insurance activity, witness statements, photographs, laboratory findings. She spent nearly 40 minutes reading without interruption. Occasionally, she made handwritten notes. Occasionally, she highlighted a page. When she finally looked up, her first question surprised me. "What outcome do you actually want?" "I want the truth." She nodded. "Anything else?" I thought for a moment. "I want this to stop." "What does this mean?" "The cycle." She waited. "The expectation that I'll always absorb the consequences because keeping peace is somehow my responsibility." Olivia leaned back in her chair. "That's an answer I don't hear very often." "What do people usually say?" "They say they want revenge." "I don't." "I believe you." She organized the paperwork into several neat stacks. "The evidence is stronger than I expected." "Strong enough." "Potentially." She pointed to different documents as she spoke. The engineering inspections established the cabin's condition before the fire. She touched another folder. The cloud backups established Brandon's presence with gasoline. Another. The insurance records establish unauthorized policy activity. Another. The forensic report establishes accelerant. Then she looked directly at me. "The difficult part isn't proving individual events." "What is it?" "Showing how they're connected." I understood. Courts preferred evidence over assumptions. The story had to be supported one fact at a time, not by emotion, not by suspicion, by documents. Olivia reached for one final folder. "This came with the probate records." I frowned. "I don't recognize it." "It's part of your grandfather Walter's trust." She opened it carefully. "I don't think anyone paid much attention to this section years ago because everyone focused on the deed. Several pages contained ordinary legal language." Then Olivia stopped. "Read this paragraph." I leaned closer. The clause explained that Walter had established a modest preservation fund years earlier. Its purpose wasn't to insure the cabin. It wasn't to increase its market value. It was intended solely to support whoever maintained and preserved the property according to his wishes. If the cabin was intentionally damaged or destroyed by any beneficiary or immediate family member seeking financial gain, that individual permanently forfeited any future claim connected to Walter's estate. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. I looked up. "So Brandon," Olivia nodded, "if investigators determine he intentionally damaged the cabin for financial benefit, he loses every remaining interest connected to your grandfather's trust." I didn't even know there was anything left. There isn't much. She smiled faintly. Some investment accounts, personal property, and future trust distributions. I stared back at the document. The irony settled slowly. If Brandon had believed destroying the cabin would somehow improve his financial future, he had done the exact opposite. Olivia closed the folder. I doubt your grandfather imagined this exact situation. No. But he clearly understood people. I smiled sadly. Better than I realized. That evening, I returned home carrying copies of every document. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than grief. Not relief, not victory, clarity. The truth no longer depended on my memory. It existed independently, in reports, in timestamps, in forensic testing, in legal documents. My phone rang just after 9 o'clock. Brandon. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded calmer than I expected. Ari, what do you want? I heard you hired a lawyer. Yes. You don't really need one. I disagree. We can settle this ourselves. How? A long silence followed. Then he spoke carefully. I can pay you back. I looked around my quiet living room. With what money? I'll figure something out. You owe creditors Brandon. I'll borrow. So you want to solve one dishonest decision with another? His breathing grew heavier. You're really going through with this. I'm cooperating with an investigation. You're choosing strangers over family. No, I answered softly. I'm choosing the truth over the version of family you've been asking me to accept for years. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. If you keep talking to investigators... He stopped. What? Everything's going to come out. I felt my stomach tighten. What exactly is everything Brandon? He hung up. Less than 15 minutes later, Olivia sent me a brief text message. The state investigator just called. They want formal recorded statements from every member of your family beginning tomorrow morning. Olivia's message sat on my phone screen long after the display dimmed. The state investigator just called. They want formal recorded statements from every member of your family beginning tomorrow morning. I wasn't nervous about my own interview. I'd spent weeks documenting facts. What unsettled me was the thought of my parents and Brandon sitting in separate rooms, unable to coordinate their stories. For years, they had spoken with one voice. Now they would have to answer individually. The next morning, Olivia met me outside the state investigative office. She handed me a cup of coffee. You sleep? Not much. That's normal. She adjusted the strap on her briefcase. Remember something important. I looked at her. You don't have to convince anyone. I know. You only have to answer what's asked. That advice turned out to be exactly what I needed. My interview lasted nearly 2 hours. The investigator, Special Agent Rebecca Sloan, never raised her voice. She simply moved through the timeline. When did Brandon first request access to the cabin? When did your parents receive copies of the insurance documents? When did you first notice unusual activity? When were the cameras damaged? Each answer led naturally to the next document. Phone records, photographs, inspection reports, cloud backups. There was no drama, just evidence. When the interview ended, Rebecca closed her notebook. Ms. Jordan. Yes, I appreciate how organized your records are. I document everything. I noticed. She smiled slightly. It makes our job easier. As Olivia and I walked toward the parking lot, we passed Brandon's attorney. He recognized us immediately. Ms. Jordan? I nodded politely. He stepped closer. I'd appreciate a moment. Olivia answered before I could. We're listening. He chose his words carefully. My client wants to resolve this without prolonged litigation. Olivia remained expressionless. What exactly does that mean? He'd like to discuss restitution. I looked at him. Restitution doesn't erase evidence. No. It may influence how certain matters proceed. Olivia crossed her arms. Has your client admitted responsibility? The attorney hesitated. He acknowledges making poor decisions. Which ones? He exercised poor judgment. Olivia smiled politely. That's not an answer. He sighed. My client maintains he never intended to destroy the cabin. That statement caught my attention. Not intended. Interesting. Neither Olivia nor I responded. The attorney continued. He believes the fire resulted from circumstances he didn't anticipate. I finally spoke. Did he tell you why he carried gasoline behind the cabin? His expression changed almost imperceptibly. I wasn't present. No. I nodded. But he was. The attorney understood the point. He thanked us for our time and walked away. Inside the elevator, Olivia looked at me. You noticed it. The wording? She nodded. They're moving away from denial. Toward negligence. Exactly. She pressed the lobby button. If they can convince a court this was reckless rather than intentional, the consequences could be significantly different. I understood. Intent mattered, especially in fraud cases. 3 days later, Daniel called. I've received additional digital evidence. What kind? Recovered text messages. My heartbeat quickened. I thought Brandon deleted everything. He deleted them. Daniel paused. He just wasn't as thorough as he believed. That afternoon, we met again. Daniel placed a printed conversation on the conference table. Several messages had been recovered from Brandon's cloud backup after investigators obtained the proper legal authorization. Most of them were ordinary: weekend plans, restaurant reservations, work complaints. Then Daniel pointed to one exchange sent the evening before the party at my cabin. A friend had written, "You sure this is smart?" Brandon replied, "Relax. It's an old cabin." Another message followed minutes later. "What if something goes wrong?" Brandon answered, "If the cabin burns, they'll blame old wiring anyway." I stared at the page. Those 11 words changed everything. Daniel remained quiet while I finished reading. Finally, I looked up. He actually wrote that. Yes. It wasn't a joke. We don't speculate. He tapped the paper gently. But this message creates significant context. Context, another carefully chosen word. Not proof of arson by itself, but powerful evidence of what Brandon expected people to believe if disaster occurred. I leaned back slowly. He was already thinking about electrical problems. Daniel nodded. Long before the fire. The following week brought the first formal court hearing. It wasn't a criminal trial, not yet. The hearing focused primarily on insurance coverage, preservation of evidence, and temporary financial claims, while multiple investigations continued. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No television cameras, no crowded gallery, just attorneys, investigators, and the people whose lives had become tangled together. Brandon avoided looking at me. My parents sat several rows behind him. They looked exhausted. Judge Eleanor Watkins reviewed the preliminary filings before turning toward Daniel. Mr. Cross, Your Honor, have you reached any preliminary conclusions regarding the insurance claim? Daniel stood. Yes. He spoke calmly. The evidence currently supports denial of any increased policy benefits resulting from the unauthorized policy modification. He paused. The original policy remains under separate review, pending final causation findings. The judge nodded. And the policy increase? Daniel answered without hesitation. Our company considers that request invalid due to unauthorized submission and apparent forgery. The word echoed through the courtroom. Forgery. My mother quietly lowered her head. The judge turned toward Brandon's attorney. Counsel, he stood. Your Honor, while my client accepts responsibility for extremely poor judgment, we dispute any allegation that he intentionally caused this loss. The judge made several notes. Olivia rose next. Your Honor. She walked toward the evidence display. We would like permission to submit additional documentation. The judge nodded. Olivia carefully organized each exhibit. The engineering inspection completed 13 days before the fire, the contractor's repair assessment, the laboratory accelerant report, the security camera footage, the insurance authentication records, finally, the recovered text messages. She handed copies to the court. No dramatic speech, no emotional appeal, just documents, one after another. The judge spent several minutes reading silently. Then she looked toward Brandon. Mr. Jordan. He slowly stood. I have one question. Yes, Your Honor. If this cabin truly meant so little. She held up the recovered text message. Why were you already discussing how investigators would explain a fire before one ever occurred? The courtroom became completely silent. Brandon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. Your Honor, my client declines to answer on advice of counsel. Judge Watkins nodded once. Very well. She closed the file. I am not issuing final findings today. Everyone remained perfectly still. The court requires additional financial analysis before determining restitution and related civil liability. She looked across the courtroom. However, another pause. Based on the evidence presented thus far, I find substantial reason for these investigations to continue without limitation. Her gavel struck once. The hearing ended. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There were no cameras. Only ordinary people walking through downtown Denver, completely unaware that my family's carefully protected image had begun collapsing under the weight of its own decisions. As Olivia and I reached the courthouse steps, my father called my name. Arianna. I turned. Richard stood alone. My mother and Brandon had already disappeared toward the parking garage. He looked at me with tired eyes. I need to tell you something. Olivia glanced at me. I'll wait by the car. Dad waited until she walked away. Then he spoke so quietly I almost couldn't hear him. I should have told investigators this sooner. What? He swallowed hard. The night before the fire. He looked toward the street. Brandon asked me where Grandpa kept the original trust documents. I stared at my father. The night before the fire. He nodded slowly. Brandon asked me where Grandpa kept the original trust documents. I frowned. What did you tell him? The truth. His voice was barely above a whisper. I told him I didn't know. Were you suspicious? I should have been. He looked toward the courthouse entrance where people continued walking in and out as though nothing extraordinary had happened. I thought he was asking because he wanted to understand Grandpa's estate. And now, he closed his eyes for a moment. Now I think he was looking for something that would justify taking the cabin. There wasn't much left to say. For years, my father had avoided difficult conversations because he believed silence preserved peace. Now he understood what silence had actually protected. It hadn't protected the family. It had protected unhealthy behavior. I'm sorry, he said. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I appreciate you saying that. He looked relieved that I hadn't argued. Then he asked the question I had been expecting ever since the investigation began. Will you ever trust us again? I answered honestly. I don't know. He nodded. I suppose that's fair. It isn't about punishment. I know. It's about reality. He looked confused. I continued. For years, I kept changing my expectations to fit everyone else's behavior. I took a slow breath. I'm not doing that anymore. He didn't defend himself. He didn't blame my mother. He didn't blame Brandon. For the first time in my life, my father simply accepted the consequences without asking me to carry part of them. I hope someday we can have a relationship again, he said. I hope so too. But it won't look like the old one. He quietly nodded before walking away. It was the last meaningful conversation we had for many months. 2 months later, every major investigation reached its conclusion. The insurance company formally denied the unauthorized policy increase because it had been obtained through fraudulent authorization. My original homeowner's policy remained valid, but only under the coverage that legally existed before anyone attempted to alter it. That distinction mattered. The investigators concluded there was no evidence that I had participated in authorized or benefited from the attempted fraud. Instead, every document pointed in the opposite direction. The cloud backups, the inspection reports, the authentication records, the laboratory analysis, the recovered messages. Together, they formed a timeline that no longer depended on anyone's opinion. Brandon eventually accepted a negotiated resolution through his attorney. He was held financially responsible for a significant portion of the property's destruction and faced criminal consequences related to the fraudulent insurance activity and evidence presented during the investigation. My parents were not accused of setting the fire. However, their participation in the unauthorized insurance changes carried legal and financial consequences of its own. They were required to cooperate, fully resolve the civil claims connected to the forged authorization, and absorb costs that could have been avoided with one honest phone call months earlier. None of them became wealthy. None of them escaped unchanged. Neither did I. People often imagine justice as one dramatic moment. A judge speaks. Someone wins. Someone loses. Real life felt different. Justice arrived through paperwork, depositions, receipts, expert reports, patient investigators, people who simply refused to ignore evidence because the people involved happened to share the same last name. The restitution I eventually received didn't erase what had happened. No amount of money could rebuild Grandpa Walter's original craftsmanship. The cedar beams he cut himself were gone. The hand-carved staircase was gone. The workshop where we had spent countless Saturdays together was gone. Those things could never truly be replaced. So I stopped trying to recreate them exactly. Instead, I built something new. Nearly a year after the fire construction began on a much smaller cabin. I designed it myself, not as a copy of the original, but as a tribute to it. The foundation incorporated several stones salvaged from Grandpa's old fireplace. One surviving cedar beam was cleaned reinforced and installed above the front entrance. Inside, the floor plan emphasized simplicity rather than size. A reading corner overlooked the creek. A workshop occupied one side of the building. Large windows faced the mountains Grandpa had loved. Above the fireplace, I framed one of his handwritten letters instead of hanging expensive artwork. Visitors always noticed it. Most of them eventually asked if they could read it. I always smiled and said yes. The sentence they remembered most wasn't about construction. It wasn't about property. It simply read, "Protect what deserves protecting, even when it's yourself." That sentence changed meaning after everything that happened. When Grandpa first wrote it, I thought he was talking about buildings. Later, I thought he meant family history. Eventually, I realized he had been talking about people, including me. 6 months after the new cabin was finished, I partnered with a local community college. A few weekends each year, engineering students visited to learn about timber preservation, structural inspections, and responsible restoration of historic buildings. The workshop wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Watching young engineers learn how careful planning could preserve something meaningful brought me more satisfaction than I ever expected. Sometimes we'd finish the day sitting on the porch with coffee while the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The conversations usually had nothing to do with lawsuits, or insurance, or betrayal. Life had finally become larger than the worst chapter I'd lived through. My relationship with my parents settled into something respectful but distant. We spoke occasionally, birthdays, major holidays, medical updates, nothing more. The boundaries weren't created to punish them. They existed because trust had to be earned again, and none of us could pretend the past had never happened. As for Brandon, I chose not to rebuild that relationship. Not out of hatred, out of clarity. Some people mistake forgiveness for unlimited access. I don't. I eventually let go of the anger because carrying it only made my own life heavier. But letting go of anger didn't require reopening a door that had repeatedly brought harm into my life. Those are two very different choices. Sometimes people ask whether losing the original cabin still hurts. The honest answer is yes. Certain losses always remain part of us. But when I stand on the porch of the new cabin and hear the creek flowing below, I don't think first about the fire anymore. I think about my grandfather handing me a hammer when I was 12 years old. I think about every lesson hidden inside ordinary weekends. I think about the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the truth doesn't need to be shouted when it's supported by facts. Most importantly, I think about something I couldn't understand for many years. A home isn't protected by locks alone. Sometimes it's protected by the courage to say no, and by the willingness to keep saying it even when the people asking are your own family. Some of the deepest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people we believed would always protect us. When family asks us to sacrifice our peace, our property, or our integrity for the sake of keeping everyone comfortable, it can become difficult to tell the difference between love and obligation. Healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. They are acts of self-respect. If you've ever been made to feel guilty for protecting something you worked hard to build, I hope this story reminds you that evidence matters, honesty matters, and your boundaries matter. Forgiveness can bring peace to your own heart, but forgiveness does not require restoring the same level of trust or giving someone unlimited access to your life again. Those are separate decisions, and only you can make them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a relationship and protecting yourself? If you're comfortable sharing, leave a comment below. Reading your experiences reminds all of us that we're not alone. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing for more thoughtful stories about family resilience, justice, and healing. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.